Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. A word of caution, if you have not yet seen the 2019 Bahrain Grand Prix, do not watch this video, massive spoilers lie ahead. So, we meet here, post-Bahrain 2019. This race had the makings of a fairy tale. If you were going to write a movie script, you would not set it up any differently than what we got yesterday from qualifying. Ferrari locking out the front row with Charles Leclerc, brand new driver to the Scuderia, taking his first career pole position in only his second start for the team, in only the second start of his second season of Formula One. Behind him, in P2, Sebastian Vettel. Thus, a Ferrari 1-2 after qualifying, putting Mercedes well and truly arrears on the second row of the grid, Hamilton and Bottas respectively. The stage was set for what should have been Ferrari's first victory of the 2019 campaign, and of course, Ferrari traditionally does do well in Bahrain. Melbourne, Ferrari, they did not exactly have the best afternoon. Perhaps we could excuse that to a point. It's the first race of the year, so perhaps they're just knocking off some of the rust after a long off-season. Also, Melbourne, it's a little bit of a different type of circuit than what we typically see on the Formula One calendar. It's a street circuit. We don't have as many of those on the calendar as we do purpose-built permanent circuits, and Melbourne always does tend to throw up an interesting result given the weather conditions down there, just getting into autumn in Australia, so it tends to be a little bit of a fluke result. Just look at the history of the Australian Grand Prix going back to 1996 at Albert Park. It does throw up some interesting results at the end of the day. So perhaps we could excuse Ferrari's lackluster performance in Melbourne, but Bahrain is a purpose-built circuit. It's a place that we know well. It's much more representative of the type of racing that we're going to see throughout the balance of the season, so taking 1 and 2 in qualifying definitely is a good indication if you're a Ferrari fan. And of course, being here on Ferrari Man 601, you know where I stand on this side of the fence. The race, however, all I can say is, you've taken pole position, you've taken second position, you've locked out the front row, you've got a 4-time world champion in one car, and you have an absolutely prodigious talent in the other car. Surely one of your drivers is going to win this race. Shouldn't be much of a problem. You've demonstrated that you're faster than your opposition all throughout qualifying. Should be a pretty academic exercise, right? Well, no. No, it wasn't. The final results from the 2019 Bahrain Grand Prix certainly do not tell the entire story of this race. After starting in positions 1 and 2 respectively, Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel found themselves swapping position through turn 1. Vettel definitely hooked up his start a whole lot better than his Monegasque teammate, thus this saw the 4-time world champion leading out of the first corner. After fighting off a charging Hamilton and Bottas, Charles Leclerc consolidated second place by the end of the first lap and thus consolidated a Ferrari 1-2 once again, although they had swapped positions relative to their starting grid slots. This is fine. However, Charles Leclerc, evidently wanting to make up for his poor start, went on an absolute charge against his teammate and eventually retook the lead. Not only did he retake the lead, but he started to pull out quite a huge gap as Vettel started to fall into the clutches of the Mercedes, both Bottas and Hamilton at different points. Leclerc pulled away. He had a gap of over 5 seconds in the early stage of the race. The gap then continued to grow. By the time we got around to the first pit stops, it was pretty clear that Ferrari were going to start favoring Leclerc in terms of race strategy. He got the prime pit stop position, and by the end of it all, he was leading the race on aggregate. This continued throughout the second stint of the race, and by the time the second round of pit stops came through, Charles Leclerc was ahead of the pit lane delta, meaning that after he made his second and final stop, he was still leading the race. Honest to goodness, stopwatch doesn't lie. You made the pit stop, you come out, you're still in P1. Awesome. Then, a couple of things happened. First of all, when you're running a Formula One team, you've got 2 cars flying your colors. Therefore, if you've got one driver who's in a position to win the race, it stands to reason that the other car should be just as good, if not a little bit better, than the one that's currently leading. So consolidating a 1-2 finish really should not be a very difficult proposition, especially when you're an elite team like Ferrari with two elite drivers, particularly a driver with the status of Sebastian Vettel, having won 4 world championships. So even if the order is swapped around, car number 2 finishing ahead of car number 1, it shouldn't really matter. You should be able to secure that. Well, no. Sebastian Vettel being overtaken by Lewis Hamilton at the end of Sector 1. There was no contact, at least none that was evident, between Hamilton and Vettel. However, upon being overtaken, Sebastian Vettel immediately, whether it was a little bit of an overreaction on his part, perhaps he misjudged how close he was to Hamilton, or perhaps he was just frustrated, he buried the gas, lit up the rears, and spun around. Yes, Sebastian Vettel bottles it once again, spinning around like a top ball by himself, losing Ferrari's chance at a 1-2 at that point. If you're a 4-time world champion, if you're team leader at Ferrari, if you have been team leader at Ferrari for 4 years, you're now in your 5th season with the team, surely you should be able to hold position. Not Sebastian Vettel. Evidently, whenever he falls under pressure, he's unable to keep his composure. He ends up spinning around or running into people, and it's just not a good situation if you're Sebastian. So he falls down the order, makes a pit stop because he also flat-spotted his tires in the spin, the vibrations from which caused his front wing to collapse, and yep, just sparks and carbon bits and everything strewn about the circuit. He makes a stop, and he replaces his front wing quite wisely. So he tumbles down the order, but damage control, maybe he should be able to pull up some positions, and he does by the end. Fine. However, you have lost out on the podium. Not so good. Charles Leclerc, to his credit, he continued on an absolutely meteoric pace. He continued to set fast lap. He held fastest lap all day long and scored a point for it, but getting toward the end of the race, with about 11 laps to go, he frantically gets on the radio saying that something strange is happening with his engine. Immediately, our eyes go to the timing and scoring screens, and we see that he's losing all kinds of time to Lewis Hamilton. The gap had been absolutely enormous, and it started to drop significantly, sector by sector. He was losing at one stage about 4 seconds a lap relative to the Mercedes, so big problem for Charles Leclerc. Later on, it became evident that it was some sort of failure with the MGU-H. This is the motor generator unit that is run off of the turbocharger. It helps to recharge the batteries. It uses boost generated by the turbocharger, the actual rotational inertia of the turbocharger, to send energy back into the MGU batteries where it can be deployed later. With that system inoperable, it means that Charles Leclerc, in addition to losing the electrical boost that he'll be getting down the straights courtesy of that system, it also may mean, and this needs to come out later on, it may mean that there's actual damage to the turbocharger itself. It sounded to me that perhaps the wastegate was stuck open and therefore the engine wasn't generating much boost at all. So not only did he lose the electrical assist, but it appeared that he may have lost a good portion, if not the entire portion, of his turbocharger boost in terms of the mechanical function of the turbocharger. So he's down on power big time. The gap was only always going to disappear. Lewis Hamilton overtakes Charles Leclerc for the lead of the race with about 8 laps to go. Leclerc continues to limp home. Eventually, he's overtaken by Valtteri Bottas as well. So the 1-2 finish that Ferrari had been holding in the beginning stages of the race, now completely, the tables are turned and Mercedes are there to pick up the spoils. A late safety car neutralizes the field, which was probably good for Charles Leclerc because he was undoubtedly going to fall into the clutches of Max Verstappen at one point, and who knows, perhaps even into the clutches of his teammate Sebastian Vettel, who eventually finished in 5th in damage control mode. In terms of the sort of damage that was on his car after that incident, well, perhaps that's okay, a decent consolation prize, but certainly it's a far cry from where they should have been if the balance of the race were to play out as it had been for the majority of the proceedings. At the end of the day, Lewis Hamilton wins the race by 2.98 seconds over his teammate Valtteri Bottas, Mercedes consolidating a 1-2 finish, the first win of the season for Lewis Hamilton. Charles Leclerc finishes on the podium in P3, the first podium of his young Formula One career, although it really should have been a lot more. the consolation prizes for Leclerc continue. He does score his first podium. He scores 15 points from finishing in P3. He scores 1 additional point for having scored the fastest lap. And he also does win the hearts of the fans by taking driver of the day by a slimmer margin than it should have been. He got 50% of the vote, so just barely a majority winning that one. I don't know who the second place driver was. I assume it would have been Lewis Hamilton. Max Verstappen finishes 4th. Sebastian Vettel in 5th. Lando Norris, great drive for him in the McLaren in 6th. Kimi Raikkonen 7th in the Alfa Romeo. 7th, Pierre Gasly. 8th, rather, Pierre Gasly. 9th, Alexander Albon. 10th, Sergio Perez, and the final point scorer. Antonio Giovinazzi finishes in 11th. Daniel Kvyat in 12th. He had a sordid afternoon. Kevin Magnussen 13th, Lance Stroll 14th, George Russell in 15th, and Robert Kubica in 16th. So the last cars classified, the Williams cars, but 15th and 16th. Out of the race, Nico Hülkenberg, Daniel Ricciardo in a pair of electrical failures, or some sort of failures. They happened at pretty much the same time. Nico Hülkenberg appeared to experience more of a mechanical failure. Something shot out the back of his car at accelerated velocity. Wasn't quite sure what it was, but it was dramatic, whatever it was. Daniel Ricciardo's car just shut off in pretty much the exact same spot on track at the same time. It's quite odd. Carlos Sainz not finishing for McLaren, and Romain Grosjean neither finishing in the second Haas car. The big storylines of this race, undoubtedly, what could have been and what arguably should have been for Charles Leclerc. His first career pole position on Saturday. He looked so set to get his first career victory on Sunday. He controlled this race so well. He had a bad start, relatively speaking. His teammate overtook him into turn 1, but he recovered. He had a lot of pace. He was clearly faster than Sebastian Vettel all day long, and then the car failed him. You would definitely forgive the guy if he got out of the car and then started cursing everyone out, but that's not what he did, and this is why I think many of us are growing to love Charles Leclerc quite quickly. The disappointment that he feels must be absolutely enormous. You just took your first pole position. You were so set to take your first career victory for Ferrari in only your second start, and you know how absolutely crazy that part of the world is. Charles Leclerc, of course, from Monaco, but for all intents and purposes, the Italian press treat him like he's Italian. It would have been such a story, and it's all gone. It all just evaporates through nobody's fault. It's a car failure. But he gets out of the car. Martin Brundle walks up to him right away. You know how they do these interviews now in Parc Fermé right after the race. And he doesn't go ballistic. Instead, he says, that's racing. These things happen sometimes. And you know what? Thank you so much to the team, because we were fast all day, and unfortunately, these things happen, but I'm on the podium anyway. We can be happy, and our day will come soon. That is the absolutely perfect response that you could have expected from Charles Leclerc. Maybe he practiced it on the cool-down lap, I don't know, but it was perfect. And again, the maturity that this guy has demonstrated both last year and now this year, particularly in this circumstance, it's incredible. Hats off to the guy. He deserved a lot more today. It didn't happen, but he handled it very well. What, if any, are the silver linings of this race, though, if you're a Ferrari fan? Well, there are a couple. First and foremost, the most obvious one is Mercedes lack pace to Ferrari. I think we've confirmed this. Had Sebastian Vettel been able to hold position, or just have been able to stick with Lewis Hamilton after he was overtaken, perhaps that could have been a battle that continued, and who knows what might have happened. Perhaps Vettel would have repassed Hamilton and consolidated that Ferrari 1-2. It's possible. Beyond that, if Charles Leclerc didn't have his car failure, he would have won the race. So if you're a Ferrari fan, you can now point at some empirical data and say, hey, Ferrari have the fastest car on the grid. I know a lot of people were saying this after winter testing, and it's always difficult to make conclusions like that after testing. Melbourne told a very different story. Valtteri Bottas absolutely dominated that race, but Ferrari dominated this entire Bahrain Grand Prix weekend, and that is something to be very excited about if you're a Ferrari fan. Compounding this observation of mine that Mercedes lack pace, immediately after the checkered flag, team radio, Hamilton to the Mercedes pits, he says, well, that was a very unfortunate happening for Charles. He really deserved to win this race today, and boys, we have work to do. Lewis Hamilton is not convinced that Mercedes truly understand their car, nor is he convinced that they have the pace fundamentally to compete with Maranello. They got very lucky today, being gifted this 1-2 finish. Lewis Hamilton's words, as well as his body language, definitely suggested that he understands that just as well as anybody. And again, in Parc Fermé, he was saying that it's very unfortunate what happened to Charles Leclerc today. Certainly, the entire world saw it, and I don't think there's too much value in trying to dispute anything otherwise. This was Ferrari's race to lose, and they lost it. However, knowing that fundamentally, at least from the appearances, from the data that we have gotten from this Bahrain Grand Prix weekend, knowing that they are quicker than Mercedes in race trim as well as in qualifying trim on the more traditional type of circuits that we're seeing throughout the balance of the season. And again, next time out we're going to China, so that's another more traditional circuit, a permanent circuit, another Herman Tilke circuit. Historically, Mercedes are strong there, but we'll see what happens. Again, the venues aren't all that different from each other. Perhaps Ferrari once again will have the pace advantage in qualifying and perhaps as well in the race. The linchpin in all of that, though, of course, is you need the reliability. If you're not going to finish, or at very least, if you're not going to maintain a reasonable level of consistency in terms of your level of performance for the entire duration of the Grand Prix, you may as well not even start it. Of course, Ferrari scored some points today, which could be important later on, but they gave up a 1-2 finish. The other silver lining really in all of this, though, is Charles Leclerc himself. He proved today that he is indisputably faster than Sebastian Vettel, both in qualifying, as we saw yesterday. Qualifying, of course, it's always a little bit difficult to read into that because we don't know how they're running the cars. We can assume that they're trimmed out to the max and that they're running just basically on fumes in terms of their fuel load. But he's faster in qualifying, but more importantly, he was faster in the race. The only point today that Sebastian Vettel comprehensively outperformed Charles Leclerc was right at the start of the Grand Prix when Vettel just hooked up that start, particularly the second phase of the start, a bit better than Leclerc did. Going back and watching the onboard with Charles right off the line, he launches very well, but it's that second phase of just getting the final bit of the clutch engagement in as you start going up through the gearbox. That's where he bogged down a little bit, and that's where Sebastian, perhaps he warmed up his rear tires a little bit better, but regardless, that's where Sebastian hooked up the start better and was able to effect an overtake into turn one. Once all of that was settled, though, and Charles got some proper heat into his tires, he drove away from Vettel, making that overtake into turn one a couple laps into the Grand Prix, and then he drove off into the sunset and would have continued to do so, barring the reliability concern that he suffered. A little bit earlier on, I said that it was an MGU-H failure. Some more information has since come out saying that it was actually a loss of spark and or fuel injection into one of the cylinders on the engines. One of the 6 cylinders in the V6 engine was not generating power either at all or had diminished output. So we'll have to see what else comes out. Again, my mind on that immediately turns into Suzuka 2017 spark plugs. Remember when Ferrari had the issue with Sebastian Vettel's V6 engine with spark plugs? Sounds like it could be another spark plug issue, or at very least some sort of distribution ignition issue. Is that something in the MGU system that could be bleeding EMF radiation and interfering with the spark plugs? Maybe. Is that something with the ECU? Is it something with the spark plug itself? We don't know, but whatever it is, it caused Leclerc's engine to drop a cylinder, and therefore with the diminished power, and also remember the diminished exhaust gas volume as well as velocity going through the turbocharger, that's going to affect your MGU-H recovery rate anyway, in addition to generating or generating a problem regarding the boost pressure that the turbocharger can generate, because again, turbocharger runoff of the exhaust, if you're losing cylinders, that's less gas going through the turbine, less RPM in the turbine blades themselves, less mechanical boost that the turbocharger can generate just as a standalone component, never mind the ancillary MGU system. So whatever caused this apparent ignition failure on Leclerc's engine, that was the reason why he suddenly dropped off the pace within the last 10 laps and gifted that 1-2 finish to Mercedes and to Lewis Hamilton. As absolutely heart-wrenching as it was to watch Charles Leclerc getting so very close to taking his first Grand Prix victory, and then to watch the timing and scoring traces slowly diminish between himself and Lewis Hamilton as we were listening to the radio message. Something strange is going on with the engine, and then inevitably Hamilton making that overtake, and later Bottas making that overtake. As terrible as that was to watch as a Ferrari fan, and as terrible as that must have felt for Charles Leclerc and the entire Ferrari pit wall, the other silver lining to this is, if it truly was just an ignition problem, that is not going to be something that would have caused damage to the engine. Sure, maybe some things fell out of temperature tolerances, but there should have been no lasting implications in terms of overall reliability of the major components in the power unit. This means that unless something else has happened that we don't know about yet, there should be no reason for Ferrari to be changing any components out of sequence with Leclerc's power unit, meaning that he shouldn't have to be taking any penalties. Of course, in this stage of the season, everybody has their full allotment of power unit and power unit components anyway, but there should be no real reason for Ferrari to be changing that power unit yet, nor should there be any reason for them to be changing anything very appreciable in there, any major components due to reliability concerns. Assuming that it was simply a spark plug related issue, that should be just a single component. They should be able to trace the failure back to that single component, that single spark plug. And then, of course, that's one of the consumable components anyway. They'd be changing that for the car's next run. So if it is just a spark plug and it just burned out a bit too early, everything should be fine, and Leclerc should be able to resume the use of this power unit as he would have been expected to do later on in the season. Whether or not they would have introduced a new power unit and start a new one in a cycle for the Chinese Grand Prix, we don't know what Ferrari's schedule for all of this is, but there should be no real reason to be concerned reliability-wise in terms of major powertrain components for either Sebastian Vettel or Charles Leclerc. Again, we saw both of the Ferraris running a bit off the pace in Melbourne. Perhaps this was something that they were a little bit marginal on reliability-wise in testing, and they were conservative in Melbourne, trying to avoid a problem like this. They pushed the engines a little bit harder in Bahrain because, remember, it's nighttime, so the conditions are more consistent. You're not going to have the temperature changes with the cloud cover as it passes over the circuit. Also, ambient temperatures are going to be lower a little bit, which means you have denser air, so the engines will be running a little bit more efficiently, so perhaps you can run them in higher engine modes, raise the revs a little bit, raise the injection density of the fuel, advance the spark timing a little bit. You know what I mean. Push them just a little bit harder. Maybe they just overstepped it a little bit too far. That's what they'll be evaluating as they go through their telemetry, as they do any bench testing, as they have some time now to go back to Maranello and figure out what's going on. And of course, during free practice 1 in particular in Shanghai, I would expect them to be running that very same power unit in that very same configuration in Leclerc's car to see if they could reproduce that failure, or at very least try to identify any trends in the data that may suggest what happened, if by that point they don't fully understand what the cause was, or if they really want to make sure that this is not going to happen again. Knowing how very fastidious engineers are in Formula One, surely they're already poring over the data on the flight back to Maranello. They're talking to the driver, I'm sure. They're talking to the guys who put the spark plugs in, so I'm sure that they will track it down. And again, I don't think there should be any more farther reaching implications in terms of overall component reliability for Charles Leclerc. It seems like it's a benign problem. It just struck at a very critical moment, quite unfortunately. However, that is the way we should be looking at the Bahrain Grand Prix if we are Ferrari fans, as I certainly think most of us are. At very least, we don't hate Ferrari with a passion. So, again, heartbreak if your name is Charles Leclerc, humiliation if your name is Sebastian Vettel, and a lot of frustration if you happen to be a Ferrari fan today. But I do have to say, overall, there was great action in this race. That fight between Leclerc and Vettel in the opening laps was fantastic, and there was a lot of great action in the midfield throughout the entire duration of the Grand Prix as well. A little bit of a clumsy moment between Kvyat and Giovinazzi going into the middle stage of the race. Giovinazzi seemed to just understeer a bit wide, and he ran into the side of Daniel Kvyat, for which I don't believe Giovinazzi was penalized. Kvyat got a penalty later on for something different. He had a pit lane speed violation, and he had a 5-second penalty for that, unrelated to the incident with Giovinazzi. Interesting to see that the stewards are basically allowing the drivers to race, which is something I thought we should be doing all along here. It is a racing series after all. But good to see that the stewards are finally showing some more discretion. They're not being too heavy-handed with penalties. Something that's objective, like a pit lane speed violation for Daniel Kvyat, yep, there it is. We can tell you conclusively how fast you were going and where you did it. So that makes sense. But these judgment calls in terms of wheel-to-wheel racing, any sorts of clumsy incidents like we saw with Giovinazzi and Kvyat, that was good to see them just say, hey, you already paid the penalty. You crashed. So figure it out. I like that a whole lot better than these time penalties, particularly these penalties that are handed out after the race is said and done. So good to see that from the steward side. And again, very encouraging to see that we did have a lot of nose-to-tail, wheel-to-wheel action, particularly in the midfield, for almost the entire duration of the Grand Prix. Bahrain historically has been a circuit that really does tend to string the cars out quite quickly because it is rather tight. Yes, there are some long straights, but the second sector in particular has a lot of tight corners in it, and these cars don't like to follow each other closely through those medium and low speed corners because they're so long now, and through the medium speed corners the aero starts to become more critical and they can't follow closely because of the turbulence. Good to see that they're able to stick with each other now. Perhaps this is a sign of things to come in 2019 with this revised aero package. We'll see what happens, but so far encouraging to see the balance of the action through the field. Very cool. I do hope that all of you enjoyed the Bahrain Grand Prix. Again, hopefully you have seen it. If you haven't seen it, well, now you don't have to because you know exactly what happens. But I also hope that you enjoyed what we've talked about here today. And of course, I'm interested in your thoughts as well. What did you glean from the Bahrain Grand Prix? Did I mention everything you thought I should have done? Have I missed something? Did I spend too long on whatever? Tell me in the comments below. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very, very much for listening. And of course, we will see you soon.